Professor Houlgate is professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick. Among his publications, I can here recall Hegel, Nietzsche, and the criticism of metaphysics, the opening of Hegel's logic, and its last 2 volumes, Hegel on Being. He served as vice president and president of the Hegel Society of America, and he was editor of the Bulletin of the Hegel Society of Great Britain, and now is currently president of the society. And today's talk is entitled Hegel's Critique of Spinoza. Thank you, Professor.
Good, thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's been a long but very interesting day, so I hope that you still have the energy for a little bit more Hegel and Spinoza. I'd also like to thank the... Oh, I'm not going to do that, sorry, it's going to have to go like that, because I'm going to bump into it.
Otherwise we don't hear it.
Okay, I'll speak loud. So I'd really like to thank the organizers. I know that it's a tremendous amount of work organizing these things, and all I can say is that from the perspective of those of us participating, it's been a great success, and there's a real sense of working together, so I'd like to express my gratitude to you for that. Okay, are we happy with this? Okay, all right. I don't get on with microphones very well. Hegel has long been criticized for misunderstanding Spinoza. Indeed, he's been charged by Pierre Macheret with systematically misrepresenting Spinoza's thought so that he could integrate it into his own system. This charge, however, is misplaced. Hegel misunderstands Spinoza in many ways, but his aim is not to assimilate Spinoza's ideas into a totalizing dialectic. His aim is rather to interpret Spinoza's thought through the concepts he takes to underlie it, namely the absolute and substance as they are conceived in his logic. Yet Hegel's account of these concepts shows that Spinoza fails to understand either one adequately. In my view, this problem remains even when we correct the errors in Hegel's reading of Spinoza. Even in this case, from the standpoint of Hegel's logic, Spinoza fails to understand fully what substance, attributes, and modes are. Hegel praises many aspects of Spinoza's thought. In particular, he states, the greatness of such thought is to renounce everything determinate, particular, and to relate only to the one. For this renunciation is the beginning of all philosophy. Yet Spinoza's substance for Hegel is not only the abyss into which everything only disappears, but it is also causa sui. In this respect, Hegel maintains, such substance is a fundamental concept in everything speculative. Hegel, however, also criticizes Spinoza. Despite being causa sui, he complains, Spinoza's substance does not develop, but remains unmoved, unbewegt, rigid, starr. It does not develop into self-knowing spirit, nor does it differentiate itself into different attributes and modes, or determine itself to be thought and extension. Hegel's Spinoza does not, therefore, derive attributes and modes logically from substance, but just assumes that substance has them. That's number 1 on your handout. I'll read out the numbers when they're relevant. Furthermore, Spinoza discovers the particular attributes of thought and extension empirically, Hegel's word, and their modes are simply taken up from representation. These modes are then conceived as modes of substance that are nothing actual in themselves, and in this way they are, Hegel says, thrown back into the one absolute substance. They are not shown, however, to re-emerge from substance through its own activity. In the Spinozist system, therefore, everything is just thrown into the abyss, but nothing comes out of it. Es kommt nichts heraus. Substance thus remains the unmoved unity in which all differences are dissolved. I quote, Everything is merely submerged and perishes in a substance which remains motionless within itself and out of which nothing ever resurfaces. Since there is for Hegel Spinoza, only substance, or God alone, the world has no subsistence, no reality in itself. His system is thus famously, for Hegel, a cosmism. This does not mean simply that there are no finite things, but the latter, as modes of God, merely seem to be things in their own right. The finite, therefore, is, I quote, only phenomenon, seeming, shine. Moreover, finite things do not persist in their illusory subsistence, but constantly disappear into the abyss of substance. Spinoza's substance thus falls short of the concept as Hegel conceives it, for unlike the latter, it does not realize itself in actual independent things in an irreducible sphere of nature. For Hegel, Spinoza, indeed, there is no nature as such, but there only seems to be. Hegel's second criticism of Spinoza is that he bases his philosophy on definitions and axioms that are presupposed and not derived, number 2. Their content may be profound and great, as with causa sui, but they are simply assumed to be true and so are unproven. Hegel insists, I quote, that no presuppositions are to be made in logic, and that philosophy must therefore begin with sheer indeterminate being. The defect of Spinoza, as Hegel puts it, is, however, precisely that he presupposes definitions. Hegel's third criticism of Spinoza is that he does not think through the implications of his great insight that determination is negation. In particular, he does not recognize that negation must be conceived as the negation of itself, as absolute negativity, number 3. As self-negating, Hegel claims, negation ceases being simply negative and constitutes affirmative being. Indeed, such self-negating negation belongs implicitly to Spinoza's substance, in which all negation and difference is dissolved. For this substance is absolute affirmation, according to Hegel, precisely through negating negation. Spinoza, however, fails to see this and conceives of substance or God without negation as only the positive, affirmative. So these are Hegel's main criticisms of Spinoza. But do they hit their target? In certain respects, I think they do. It is true, for example, that Spinoza does not derive the concept of attribute or the attributes of thought and extension from the concept of substance. Number 4. Why does substance have attributes? Spinoza does not tell us. We could argue that substance has attributes because, to quote Spinoza, each one expresses a certain eternal and infinite essence. But why does substance, or indeed anything, have an essence? And why should the essence of substance or God be expressed in an infinity of attributes? Spinoza does not explain. He also fails to explain why thought and extension are attributes of substance, as we just heard earlier. He takes singular thoughts as given and infers from this that, I quote, there belongs to God an attribute whose concept all singular thoughts involve, but he does not explain how and why substance differentiates itself into thought and extension. The case of modes is more complicated, since they could be said to be derived from substance insofar as they are effects of the latter's causality, number 5. Yet this does not address Hegel's criticism, for Spinoza does not explain why substance exercises causality, why it is the cause of all things or of itself. He does not explain, therefore, why logically substance should have modes, or why there should be finite modes, or infinitely many of them. Indeed, Spinoza does not explain why being should take the form of substance. His first axiom in the Ethics is, whatever is either in itself or in another, and this distinction clearly coincides with that between substance and modes. Yet this axiom and the distinction it proposes is simply asserted by Spinoza without further justification. It's the first axiom. And so no proof is provided that being must be substance. In his logic, Hegel begins with pure being and then derives the categories of being in itself and being for other, and later essence and substance. Hegel thus explains why, logically, being must be substance. Spinoza, however, leaves this unexplained. Hegel also charges Spinoza with presupposing his definitions of substance, attribute, and mode. In so doing, Hegel overlooks the fact that Spinoza's definitions are not purely arbitrary, since they have to, I quote Spinoza, explain the inmost essence of the thing, not just some of its properties. Yet Spinoza presupposes the objects to be defined, and thereby also their definitions without proper justification. Hegel is right, therefore, that Spinoza does not derive his definitions or their objects, as he should do, from a starting point that is systematically presuppositionless. Number 6. In saying this, Hegel is not seeking to integrate Spinoza into his totalitarian dialectic, as Macherey charges. He criticizes Spinoza for taking for granted what he should prove, and so for being dogmatic. And this criticism, in my view, is correct. It's also true, as Yitzhak Melamed has noted, that Spinoza does not conceive of negation as self-negating, and thus as constitutive of affirmative being. Number 7. Indeed, Spinoza keeps being in essence altogether free of negation. Since God is absolutely infinite, he argues, I quote Spinoza, whatever expresses essence and involves no negation pertains to its essence. Similarly, since determination is negation, it does not pertain to the thing in regard to its being. For Hegel, being is shot through with negation. For Spinoza, however, in Hegel's words, being is only being, nothing is only nothing, and neither participates in the other. Spinoza thus remains, in this sense, a disciple of Parmenides. Now, one further Hegelian criticism of Spinoza looks mistaken, but is correct, I think, when interpreted in the right way. Hegel claims that Spinoza's substance is rigid and unmoved, but this is very hard to reconcile with Spinoza's insistence that God's essence is, I quote, the power by which he and all things are and act. Yet what Hegel means by saying that Spinoza's substance is unmoved is that it does not differentiate itself logically into its attributes and modes. And this, surely, is true. It's number 8. Such substance is indeed the cause of its modes, but it just is this cause and does not determine itself logically to be such. It thus remains eternally what it is, and in this sense is unmoved. So far, so good. Several of Hegel's claims about Spinoza, however, are clearly wrong. Spinoza's substance is not the abyss into which differences are dissolved, but the creative power from which follow infinitely many things in infinitely many modes. Also es kommt doch etwas heraus. Number 9. The different attributes are not merely distinctions that an external understanding makes, but they belong as distinct to substance itself. Number 10. Modes, too, do not merely exist in an external understanding, but they are modes of substance that are caused by the latter as well as by other modes. Number 11. Nor are finite modes for Spinoza mere shine, and so nothing actual. They are the real effects and expressions of substance. They also exercise their own causality, in direct contradiction of Hegel's claim that Spinoza does not proceed from substance to the relation of causality. Parce Hegel, therefore, the world for Spinoza does have subsistence and reality, even though it comprises modes of God. A further aspect of Hegel's critique of Spinoza is more difficult to assess. This is number 12. Hegel claims that the universal does not come to be for itself or self-conscious in Spinoza's modes. This, however, looks wrong, since Spinoza argues in the Ethics that, I quote Spinoza, God's love of men and the mind's intellectual love of God are one and the same, and that God, the universal in this case, is thus self-conscious in our knowledge and love of him. Yet there remains a subtle difference between Hegel and Spinoza. Hegel writes in his encyclopedia that, I quote Hegel, God is only God insofar as he knows himself, and his self-knowing is further his self-consciousness in human beings. Spinoza's view, however, is somewhat different. His God knows himself in our self-consciousness, and in that sense becomes spirit. But he does not thereby become God. For Spinoza, God is and remains prior to his modes, and the cause of the latter. God is, of course, the immanent cause of his modes, so all the latter are in God, and equally he is in them, since all things are and act through his power. Yet God, as creative power, or natura naturans, is the ground of, and in that sense distinct from, the modes of himself in which he is immanent. Spinoza's substance or God is thus subtly different from the absolute as Hegel conceives it. Such substance is the ultimate, immanent cause to which all modes as its effects point back. By contrast, the absolute in Hegel's logic comes to be itself in and through its modes. As Hegel writes in the Phenomenology, the absolute is essentially result, is only what it is at the end, and herein lies its nature, its being actual, subject, or the becoming of itself. In this respect, I think Hegel is right to say that Spinoza's substance is not God or Geist in the full sense. So Hegel is wrong to claim that Spinoza's substance or God is an abyss in which differences are simply dissolved. Yet Hegel's conception of such substance is not wholly consistent, since he also understands it to be the absolutely free cause, and thus effective activity, Wirksamkeit, to be power, Macht, that is also act. This inconsistency arises because Hegel understands substance to express two different but related concepts from the logic, the absolute and substance proper. Now, Hegel argues that criticism of a philosophy should be immanent. I quote, you know the passage, true refutation must enter into the power of the opponent and place itself in the circle of his strength. Yet this does not just mean that we must examine philosophical texts closely. It also means that we must provide an immanent account of the concept or concepts informing a philosophy. This concept is presupposed in Hegel's interpretation of that philosophy, but it is derived in a logic that is itself systematically presuppositionless, one that begins from an utterly indeterminate starting point, not from assumed definitions or axioms. The advantage of Hegel's method, if his derivation of categories is indeed immanent, is that he interprets other philosophies through concepts that are properly conceived. The risk, however, is that Hegel attaches the wrong concept to a philosophy, or that he attaches the right concept but overlooks nuances in that philosophy that do not match the concept. This latter, I think, is what happens in Hegel's interpretation of Spinoza. He's right to see in Spinoza's substance aspects, and I stress aspects, of the absolute and of substance proper. But he largely ignores several features of Spinoza's world that do not fit either concept, such, for example, as the infinite modes, about which Hegel says almost nothing. So let us consider the absolute as Hegel conceives it. Now, this little bit is a bit tricky, I'm afraid, but I'll do my best. This absolute, and this is the section on Wirklichkeit and the last part of the Logic of Essence for those of you who are not familiar with it. This absolute for Hegel is the totality that contains all there is, all forms of being and essence. And yet it is absolutely itself, with no internal differences, the absolute as sheer identity. Furthermore, it's both at once. The identity in which all differences are contained, but as dissolved or sublated. Number 13. Now, as sublated, difference is not just absent from, but implicit in the absolute, together with the negativity or reflexion that generates difference. Yet, insofar as reflection is merely implicit and does not permeate the absolute explicitly, its explicit form must fall outside the absolute as external reflection. As external, however, reflection dissolves differences back into the absolute, into its identity, and the absolute thus turns out to absorb once again what its own identity has just set outside it. Note, however, that the absolute to which reflection returns is the explicit negation of reflection and its differences. This is number 14. As such, Hegel argues, it is no longer the absolutely absolute in which difference is implicit, but the relative absolute. The absolute as sheer identity without difference and negation. This, Hegel states, is the absolute as attribute, the absolute as it is posited, gesetzt, by external reflection. So the attribute is the absolute to which external reflection returns as the negation of reflection and difference. Yet reflection, Hegel insists, is not merely external to, but also implicit in, the initial absolute absolute. It is the inner reflection through which difference is dissolved into identity. As such, it determines the absolute to be identity rather than difference, and so it too turns the absolute into something determinate and one-sided, into an attribute. The absolute is thus given the form of an attribute by external and internal reflection. Note that this attribute is the absolute in a determinate form. It thus has the whole content of the latter, the totality of the absolute, in it. Indeed, this totality as absolute is what sustains the attribute. It is, I quote, the true and single subsistence of the attribute. Hegel goes on to argue that since the attribute is determinate, and so is this in contrast to that, it can be accompanied by several other attributes, each of which expresses the totality of the absolute in its own way. Unlike the absolute as such, therefore, the attribute is not intrinsically singular. Yet the attribute is also ambiguous and logically undermines its own determinacy. Now, the absolute into which reflection returns, as we've seen, is the negation of determinacy and difference, is sheer identity. As such, however, the absolute is itself determinate, identity in contrast to difference, and so is merely attribute. It's the negation of determinacy, and so it's determinate, and so it's attribute. And yet the attribute is precisely absolute identity, and thus the sublation of all determinacy, including its own. This does not now mean that the attribute has no determinacy. It is determinate. It is identity, not difference. In this very identity, however, determinacy is also explicitly negated, or, to quote Hegel, it is posited as sublated. To repeat, number 15, the absolute into which reflection returns is indeterminate abstract identity, and so paradoxically, the absolute in the determinacy of identity. It is thus the absolute as attribute rather than true absolute. This attribute, however, is sublated by its own identity. This does not mean it's eliminated, but it is reduced by reflection to a merely seeming determinacy, mere Schein. When the absolute's determinacy is conceived explicitly as something null, nichtig in itself, it is conceived as a merely fleeting way and manner, Art und Weise, or a mode of the absolute. This mode does not now supplant the attribute, rather the attribute itself takes the form of a mode when it is thought explicitly as mere Schein, as the absolute's nichtig, vanishing determinacy. The absolute, therefore, is necessarily determinate through reflection and has an attribute or attributes, but the latter does not exist apart from its modes. Okay, so the attribute is the absolute as determinate, and so is negation. It is identity, not difference. Yet the attribute also takes the form of a mode. As such, Hegel claims it's external to the absolute, since as mere Schein, as explicitly negative, it falls outside the absolute's identity. Indeed, the mode is external to the absolute, even insofar as the absolute determines itself through inner reflection to be a mode. In this case, though, the mode is the self-externality, Außer-sich-Sein, of the absolute. In the essential relation, which precedes the absolute in the logic, the inner is essence and the outer is being, the sphere of finite things subject to change and destruction. The self-externality of the absolute, therefore, is, I quote, the absolute's loss of itself in the changeability and contingency of being. So in the mode, the absolute takes the form of existing things that come into being and pass away, but that relative to the absolute itself lack subsistence and are mere Schein. Okay, now this is the nodal bit, that gets a little bit tricky. A mode, Hegel maintains, passes away without turning back into itself, in contrast to the absolute, which retains its self-identity despite the changing of its modes. The mode, however, is doubly negative. It is determinate and so negative. But as mere Schein, it is the negative as a mere negative. As such, Hegel argues, the mode doubles back on itself, reinforces its negative character, and thereby relates to itself. And in so doing, it exhibits self-identity after all, the self-identity that is constitutive of the absolute. That's number 16. The mode, we recall, is a mode of the absolute. It falls outside the absolute's identity, yet it is also the absolute self-externality, the absolute that falls outside itself in the form of the mode. The mode, however, has now been shown to exhibit self-identity. This is not the determinate identity of the attribute, but the identity that consists in relating to oneself, the identity that characterizes the absolute as such. So in the mode, the absolute manifests its own self-identity. This self-identity, however, emerges through the movement of reflection, both inner and outer. It is the self-identity of the absolute that is posited by reflection as it determines the absolute to be attribute and then mode. The absolute is identity from the start. It is, however, I quote, first posited, gesetzt, as absolute identity in the mode. Indeed, it is only in the mode that the absolute is truly self-identical, and so truly what it is. The absolute, as such, is absolute identity. Through external and inner reflection, however, it is determined to be attribute and to have modes, and in that sense becomes external to and divided from itself. As the mode then exhibits self-identity, the self-identity that belongs to the absolute overcomes its self-division and becomes again equal to itself. Indeed, it becomes fully self-identical for the first time. Self-identical through the differences that its initial self-identity makes necessary. It is in its modes, therefore, that the absolute is truly self-identical and truly itself, truly absolute, number 17. More precisely, the absolute is truly self-identical only as the movement of recovering its self-identity in its self-externality, in its modes. It is, I quote, the reflexive movement as which alone the absolute is truly absolute identity. The absolute, therefore, proves to be more than just an abyss. It proves to be the logical ground of its attributes and modes, and through them of its true self. Okay, now Hegel states, I quote, that the concept of the spinozistic substance corresponds to the concept of the absolute as it is set out in the logic. And the latter concept clearly explains significant aspects of Hegel's interpretation of Spinoza. Like the initial absolute, substance for Hegel's Spinoza is the abyss in which difference disappears. Like the absolute attribute, at least in part, Spinoza's attribute is substance in a determinate form that exists for external understanding. Unlike the mode of the absolute, Spinoza's modes are beings that in relation to substance have a merely illusory subsistence. These Hegelian claims about Spinoza, however, are mistaken. For Spinoza, the real Spinoza, substance is not an abyss, but creative power that has its own attributes and through them produces real modes of itself with their own causality. Nonetheless, Hegel's concept of the absolute explains to a large degree why he misreads Spinoza as he does. Furthermore, Hegel draws on his account of the absolute to make a legitimate criticism of Spinoza, legitimate in my eyes anyway. For while Hegel derives the attribute and mode logically from the absolute, he charges Spinoza, rightly, with failing to derive them logically from substance. Neither Hegel's Spinoza nor the real Spinoza provides such a derivation, number 18. Indeed, Hegel's account of the absolute grounds a further legitimate criticism of both Hegel's Spinoza and the real Spinoza. This is that attributes and modes belong to the absolute, not, as both Spinozas think, to substance, number 19. Hegel's demand that Spinoza derive the attributes and modes from substance is thus in fact impossible to fulfill. You can't do it. Spinoza certainly must show the logical necessity of attributes and modes, but he can do so only by deriving them from the absolute, not from substance. Moreover, such a derivation, as set out in Hegel's logic, reveals serious inadequacies in the real Spinoza's conception of attributes and modes. This is number 20. It shows that, parce Spinoza, attributes are the product of negativity or reflection, both external and internal, and are distinguished from one another by negation, and so are determinate. It also shows that modes are things that relative to the absolute are mere shine, and that logically there can be no infinite modes. If Hegel's derivation is right, they're logically impossible. Yet Hegel's interpretation of Spinoza's substance rests not just on his concept of the absolute, but also on his own concept of substance. Unlike the absolute, substance for Hegel is not the abyss in which differences disappear, but the tranquil coming forth of itself in the movement of its accidents. It then proves to be the absolute power within its accidents that creates and destroys them and converts them from possibility to actuality and vice versa. Now, this conception of substance clearly underlies the idea advanced by Hegel's Spinoza that substance is power and effective activity. Again, however, Hegel's concept of substance provides grounds for an important critique of both his Spinoza and the real Spinoza. This is number 21. Hegel praises Spinoza's conception of substance as causa sui for being genuinely speculative. But substance, as Hegel conceives it, is not itself causa sui. It is, quote, being that is because it is, and so is the unity of being and essence. But parce both Spinozas, it does not cause itself to exist through its own essence. Indeed, substance for Hegel does not in itself involve causality at all. And when it does lead logically to causality, the latter, causality, takes the form of finite, not absolute causality. Hegel's idea that substance realizes itself in finite causes clearly echoes an idea of Spinoza's, the real Spinoza, that Hegel overlooks, namely that substance causes finite modes that produce their own effects through being determined to do so by other finite modes. For Hegel, however, substance as such does not exercise any causality, nor does it have modes or attributes. Hegel clearly misunderstands aspects of Spinoza's philosophy. Yet his logical accounts of the absolute and substance ground a critique of Spinoza that applies even when Hegel's errors are corrected. For if Hegel is right about the absolute and substance, and for some, this is a big if, then Spinoza misunderstands substance, attributes, and modes, number 22. Parce Spinoza, the absolute, not substance, has attributes and modes, and substance exercises no causality, at least before it takes the form of finite substances. This critique of Spinoza, in my view, is both important and correct. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question. Professor Sankaule.
Thank you so much. It's open. Thank you.
Read it? Ah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. Just one point. I'm missing, in truth, the whole day, a notion to come after the absolute in the logic of essence, which means the absolute relation of some substantiality. Das absolute Verhältnis der Substantialität. And this is the point to which Hegel points later on in the Begriffslogik as the starting point for the true refutation of Spinozism. And we should talk about this notion, I think. It's coming after the absolute.
Yes, I mentioned that. I said specifically that substance. Okay.
Substance.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
Because
Okay.
Hegel himself points to this point. This is the starting point, he says.
Yeah. Okay.
Die Widerlegung Spinozas beginnt im Verhältnis der Substantialität,
Okay. Yes.
nicht mit der Substanz in der Seinslogik, nicht mit dem Absoluten in der Wesenslogik.
Okay. Sorry.
Das
First of all,
das bedeutet Enthüllung der Substanz im Begriff.
Okay. I only have 35 minutes. And für mich, Substanz equals Substantialität. Okay, I'm not distinguishing the two of them. I only have 35 minutes. I wanted to concentrate on the absolute. I absolutely agree. The point was that there are three sections at the end of the logic of essence. The absolute, Wirklichkeit, and Substantialitätsverhältnis. That last part focuses on substance and its accidents, and then the relation of substances as finite causes to one another. My point was that, in fact, Hegel's notion of substance does not match Spinoza's. And this is something we should recognize. So when Hegel in the Begriffslogik looks back and says that we've given an immanent critique of Spinoza in that section, well, strictly speaking, he hasn't. He's given an immanent critique of the aspect of Spinoza that he reads through that category. But for Spinoza, substance is the cause of itself, and it produces modes that themselves exercise their own causality. But Hegel's Substanz, which is in relation to Accidentalität, so it is also relational, is not causal. It's not causal. And in fact, you're going to talk about this tomorrow, das Sein in allem Dasein. What substance is das Sein in allem Sein. It's not the cause of itself. Now, it leads on to causality, but of course, when substance takes the form of causality, it takes the form of finite causes in relation to other finite causes that ultimately end up in reciprocal causality, and that geht über in den Begriff. So, I appreciate what you say, but I guess what I'm trying to do is be faithful to Hegel and be faithful to Spinoza. And I don't think we should think that Hegel's account of the Substantialitätsverhältnis actually is an account of Spinoza's substance. That's my point. Well, okay, okay. Right, okay, but Klaus, let's just, what Hegel's trying to do, and I think he's trying to do it honestly, is he's not constructing something. His view is, as you know, and I think has been pointed out earlier, that the history of philosophy largely sort of mirrors, but not in all its contingencies, obviously, the development of concepts in the logic. And so Hegel is looking to various concepts in the logic to understand various historical figures. And the concepts he thinks are appropriate for Spinoza are the absolute and substance, or substantiality. And it seems to me, I did emphasize that I think he's right as regards certain aspects of Spinoza. But I don't think what Hegel comes up with matches Spinoza in every respect. So in that way, we've got to say that Hegel doesn't deliver the kind of imminent reading that we might want to give if we were teaching Spinoza, you know, as I have done regularly for many years. But I don't think it's just a construct either. I don't think Hegel's being arbitrary. I think he's discerning what he thinks is the begriff that's underlying Spinoza. And as I say, in certain aspects, I think he's right. In other aspects, I think he's wrong. So I would want to, anyway, I'm just repeating myself. I think I'll leave it at that. But I wouldn't want to say it's just a construction. I think that's a little bit, a bit too arbitrary.
Gregor?
Thank you. This was quite wonderful, and it's absolutely great to see people fired up about metaphysics. So thank you very much for this.
Yes. In our family, every day, around the dinner table, you know, the kids, come on, Dad, let's have a fight about metaphysics.
That's really good. So, two comments. Playing the devil's advocate. First, the whole question of derivation, and you know, why doesn't Spinoza show us how does he come from substance to attributes and so on? We've been discussing this with Klaus in the coffee break. The question of Anfang, which I think we should recognize is a historically contingent German problem. It was a very specific problem of well, Klaus might disagree when I say that it's historically contingent. You might disagree, but I think it's very logical that this question of Anfang and things having to, you know, reason having to find its own Anfang in itself without, you know, any kind of help of religion or faith. I think this is a very specific historical contingency. And then, you know, why would we, you know, we, just as much as you say that Spinoza also just uses contingent terms, typical for his historical period. You cannot, you know, think beyond that. It's the questions and topics that he uses. And so I think there's no reason for Spinoza to have a question of Anfang in the way that Hegel and other German idealists have. So that's one, sorry? Okay, but Yitzhak will add. But I have another comment which is very quick, which I suppose it's a clarification comment question. Between 7 and 9, your claims, I'm very grateful that you did this so that we don't have to take notes because you've taken them for us.
It would have been impossible to follow without it, I know, yes, I appreciate that.
So my question in regards 7 and 9, the reason is that you say 9 comes what Hegel gets wrong, but 7 is what Hegel gets right when criticizing Spinoza. But the thing is, the way I see it, Hegel's claim that Spinoza's substance is basically an abyss is precisely his claim that is the same as his claim that Spinoza has only negation. Because the way Spinoza argues, the way Hegel argues that Spinoza's system is just an abyss where everything vanishes is just a version of him saying that all determination is negation. And yes, well, that's just that. Spinoza's story ends there. And it doesn't matter how much Spinoza argues about 1,000 roses and everything is productive and everything is alive. It doesn't matter for Hegel because in the end, it's just, you know, one-sided negation. There's no second negation. There's no negation of negation. So I would argue that 7 and 9 are the same thing, and therefore you cannot say that, you know, it's right or wrong.
All right, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a lot in there. We've got a good 5 hours to go, haven't we? We don't have to go anywhere, and that's great. Good. That's good to do. Yes. Okay. On the question of derivation, I think I think it is related to the question of beginnings. You're right, but I think one can also see the question of derivation in much more traditional terms. It's questions of justification, of necessity, of why should we believe such and such. Now Hegel has a very strict sense of what it takes in order to provide such a derivation. And on my reading, at least, and a number of others, that requires stripping everything back to a very minimal beginning, taking as little for granted as possible, thinking in a systematically presuppositionalist way, and of course then this raises the question of the Anfang. But I think there are people who are not Hegelians can worry about whether Spinoza's definitions are legitimate and justified. Yet I absolutely do not agree, I'm sorry, that the question of the Anfang is a historically conditioned German problem. I mean, Descartes, to my knowledge, wasn't German. And indeed, Spinoza, it seems to me, is concerned with beginnings. I mean, I slipped it in, but Spinoza's definitions are not arbitrary. Then, of course, he's historically conditioned in some way. I mean, the very fact that he talks about substance, attribute, and modes, but he's trying to find definitions which generate the object, not which give you properties of them. And so when he does think about what are appropriate definitions, so I would put Spinoza on the side of the angels there. He is thinking about beginnings. But having said that, I think you're right that thinking about derivation means thinking about beginnings. And I guess, I mean, it sounds irritating to everybody who doesn't interpret Hegel along the way that I do, really, is that my view is there is no alternative, if we're going to answer the question of derivation, than to start in the way Hegel does in the Logic. I've taught, I'm sure as we all have, a lot of different philosophers, and it seems to me all of them in some way have some question-begging aspect. So I would say that the question of derivation is important, and Spinoza does fall short from Hegel's point of view in that respect. But I think he is concerned with the Anfang. I think that's not fair. What was the other point? Now, that's really interesting. Okay, I think you're right in Hegel's mind. I think in Hegel's mind, if I can't see properly here, that, in fact, this point is made exactly by Hegel, if I'm right, in the remark to Dasein, is that the one? Where he says that the idea that determination is negation leads us to the notion of a substance as an absolute Einheit. And some people scratch their head and think, how do you get there? Well, you get there very easily. If determination is negation and substance is pure affirmation, it ergo has no negation, ergo it has no internal determination, ergo it's an absolute Einheit. And then it's not far from that to the idea of an abyss. Absolutely, I think you're right. But what I was saying here, if you notice, 7 is under what Hegel gets right about the real Spinoza. 9 is under about what Hegel gets wrong about the real Spinoza. My point was that although logically the argument that you're tracing there, yes, I can understand Hegel's argument, but I'm afraid the brute fact of Spinoza's text suggests that substance is not an abyss. And of course, there's the other side of Spinoza that Hegel acknowledges when he thinks that also Spinoza's substance is causa sui and is the power, the Macht, to act. So there's even an inconsistency there. So that's how I would separate them out. That, again, if you like, Spinoza is not fitting neatly into the logic that Hegel's tracing. And I think we need to acknowledge that. There's no point in doing Hegel and Hegel Spinoza. We need to do Hegel and Hegel Spinoza and the real Spinoza, or the real Spinozas. Well, okay, Klaus, okay, Klaus, just calm down, okay? I'm looking at one at this very minute as someone whose work I greatly respect. There are a lot of people. I would read Henry Allison. I would read Macheret. I would read Bennett. I would read lots of people. And I would read Yitzhak, probably above all. I'm not a Spinoza expert, but I have been teaching Spinoza for well over 10 years, every other year. So I like to think I put a bit of effort into trying to get Spinoza right. So when I talk about the real Spinoza, I'm not being naive. I know there are different interpretations. Bennett, you don't agree with Curley, and I know there are differences. But we know that there's another Spinoza out there who isn't captured by Hegel Spinoza. Again, Klaus, we've only got 35 minutes, okay? We can only say what we can say. There are other qualifications, obviously, I should have given, but That's what I mean by the real Spinozas. Or I'll pluralize, if you like, the real Spinozas. Let's have that.
Okay, so Ferrer. No. Yeah, there was this order, Ferrer, Vittorio, and...
Well, I suppose we should speak about to the all those French interpreters also about the real Hegel and Hegel in these versions. Well, but that was not my point. I think, well, what Hegel is doing is thinking how Spinoza should have thought. So this is very important. I think your point of separating between absolute and substance in Hegel, in the science of logic, that's really an important point for interpretation. As I take, I don't know if you agree, as I take it, in the absolute and mode, he's saying how Spinoza should have thought. Well, he should have thought like that if he were coherent. Well, then when he speaks about substance, that's already no more how Spinoza should have thought, but well, in some way how Spinoza thought about substance as necessity. Well, anyway, my question, then I would say, perhaps we should construct this difference between substance and absolute, taking into account this Hegel's intention is not to interpret the real Spinoza, but to say how Spinoza should have thought, if he were consequent. Well, anyway, when you say that substance exercises no causality, I would think Hegel says that substance dialectically transforms itself into category, into causality. Then in that sense, also Spinoza should have thought like that, so that he could understand how substance exerts causality. Well, and then of course we go to reconstruct freedom through reciprocal action. You did a very short reference to modality, and I should ask why is modality between the absolute and substance? That would be also another question for me. Thank you.
Good,
well,
yes.
Anyway, I agree with everything. I should perhaps only construct in a different way.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much for that question. Yes, and I think that I would, yes, but I'd want to qualify it ever so slightly. I mean, I do think that the, okay, how to explain this? Let me just backtrack. The distinction I try to use when actually teaching Spinoza, but also teaching Hegel, is to draw a threefold distinction rather than the usual twofold distinction between, if you like, the normative and the descriptive, the sort of the ought and the is. It seems to, if we're brought up in a Kantian environment, we've pretty much only got a twofold distinction. You've got the understanding of what is, theoretical knowledge, and you've got the understanding of what ought to be, practical and sort of normative knowledge. But I think Hegel, Spinoza, Plato have a third idea, which is the true nature of such and such. So when Hegel's talking about the state, for example, he's not obviously describing 19th century states. I mean, he's pulling things from lots of different states, and the corporations had been abolished by that time, so there's no state that looks like that. But he's not just giving us an ought either. He's giving us the true idea of the state, what the state in truth is, just like Plato is trying to articulate what justice is. Now, I think in that sense, Hegel's logic is normative. It's telling us what being is, must logically be thought to be in all its categories. And so by the time we get to the absolute and substance, yes, there's a normative dimension to this. What the absolute is, what substance is, what begriff is, how it must be thought. And clearly, for those philosophers who don't think like that, then Hegel's account becomes much more normative. Indeed, it does for all of us. I mean, he's not just directing this at Spinoza, but I think Hegel's idea is to try and reinigen, clarify the Kant's concepts with which we all ordinarily operate. He's trying to get us to understand properly what it is to be something, what is quantity, and so on. So there's absolutely a normative dimension to that. And so I agree with that. I think he is saying, Spinoza, this is how you should have thought attributes and modes as belonging to the absolute. This is how you should have thought substance. But I think there's more than that. I think the reason he's focusing on Spinoza in particular is that Spinoza does in part get it. That's the thing, more than other philosophers. And I think that's what's significant. And I think that's what matters to me. Not does Hegel get it right about every aspect of Spinoza? Well, no, he doesn't. But is Spinoza the philosopher who gets it about the absolute and substance more than anybody else? And I would say yes, I think that's right. I think it's legitimate for Hegel to associate these categories with Spinoza rather than, say, Malebranche or somebody else. So I'd say yes, how Spinoza should have thought, but also did in fact think to a degree. There's a parallel, sorry, I know we're probably running out of time, but an exact parallel in, you might think this is a leap, but in Hegel's so-called critique of Kant in The Philosophy of Right. You know, Hegel derives the notion of morality, we get abstract duty. And a lot of Kantians have pointed out, say that Kant's moral philosophy is not that abstract. But Alan Wood came out with a very good idea. What Hegel's doing is showing what Kant is entitled to. And to the extent that Kant has a richer concept of morality, he's not, strictly speaking, entitled to it. Now, I think that's right. And I'm sort of, there's a normative dimension to it. So thank you. It's a helpful question, and that's how I would respond.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this marvelous handout that could be the object of a seminar of a week or something like that. My question is similar to the question of Gregor, but is on a precise point. You say point 6, what Hegel gets right. Spinoza does not derive his definition on, or their objects from a starting point that is systematically presuppositionless. Sorry for the difficulty. Of course, Spinoza has a presupposition. Spinoza is a mode and of the substance, so is in relation with the world. And for example, in the appendix of part 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza says it would be impossible to break with the teleological or finalistic bias if has not existed Euclid or geometry. So the presupposition for philosophy is science, and the direct presupposition for of Spinozan thought is Cartesian, Descartes, the Cartesian thought. So substance, attributes, and modes are terms fundamental for Descartes. And I think from what point of view we must judge Spinoza? Not from the derivation. It's a German problem, in the idealistic problem. No, of course I don't want to say something racist. Or it's of course no. But it's a problem of the idealism, and the other problem is the problem of deduction. For example, the critics that is made by Fichte, by Schelling, and by Hegel is there is not a deduction of the finite from the infinite. So if we judge Spinoza with these lenses, I think we lost the operation made by Spinoza. That is to produce some effects, theoretical effects, on the field of Descartes. So when he poses one substance, he is changing the sense of substance in Descartes. In Descartes, the term substance is equivocal. So you have only one substance, and when he says God, sorry, I've written that in English because it's difficult for me to translate from Italian, but God is cause of itself in the same sense, Deleuze has a lot insisted on that, the same sense of in which it is cause of all other things. So he is changing. In this sense, I think we must think the method of Spinoza not as a geometrical method that has some evidence at the beginning, but as a sort of political method, a kind of machine that is, I don't know if machine is the right term, to transform the imaginary.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just answer the original? Can I just answer your original point? Because okay, let me throw a question back to you. When you're listening to a political debate, do you ever sometimes say to yourself, "Oh well, I mean, he's just taking that for granted. I mean, he's not proving that. He's just asserting that." Well, I think we do. I think we all do at times. You know, we acknowledge that certain kind of discourses have certain presuppositions, but we also object when we think that they shouldn't have. Now, it seems to me that the demand for derivation is the demand for a certain justification, for necessity, a demand not just to take for granted the point you're making. And I don't think that's just a historically conditioned German problem. I think that's a problem rooted in the nature of argument and what it is to try and understand and justify what we do. And I think, as I say, I think Hegel and Spinoza, I think Spinoza is on the side of the angels in that case, because I think Spinoza's worried and does think about how to begin. I think Descartes thinks about how to begin. I'm not sure Leibniz does. At least when I teach Leibniz, it's not clear where I start. I don't know about Plato either, but they're doing different things. That's my main worry. I think there may well be historical circumstances that explain why the question of justification receives the kind of prominence and the answer it receives. And I think there is in the case of Hegel, and the obvious context is that of freedom broadly understood. I mean, Hegel himself situates his own philosophy in the context of philosophical freedom, you know, Fichte, Kant, Rousseau, political freedom, the French Revolution, religious freedom, the Reformation. And another way of thinking about suspending assumptions and not taking things for granted is not to take things on authority. Now, rightly or wrongly, Hegel thinks that Catholicism takes things on authority. Protestantism is meant to free us from authority. Whether he's right about that is not my concern, but he associates Lutheranism with a move within religion to liberate us from simple authority. And I think if you think of it in that way, would you really want to have a way of arguing that just based itself on authority? You say, okay, well, I'll argue this, and okay, then you just got to believe me, because that's it, I'm saying it. No, we wouldn't. We'd say, come on, that's wrong. Justify your position. Now, I think Hegel takes that back to a very minimal position. Now, when you think about it, Spinoza gets pretty close. Hegel begins with pure being. Spinoza begins with being plus intelligibility in terms of causality. So Spinoza's substance is just being understood, as the cause of itself, as intelligible. And you could say Hegel's being is intelligible, Spinoza's being is intelligible. Hegel's just isn't intelligible through causality, whereas Spinoza's is. They're very close. There's not far for Spinoza to go, if you like, to get to where Hegel is. And I think it's worth thinking about that yes, of course, you're right. The vocabulary of modes and substance has a history there. But I think the reason I put you through the agony of going through the absolute is to show that Hegel thinks there is a logical reason why we would still think in terms of attributes and modes, even though we're not immediately indebted to the medieval period. Even now, in modernity, attributes and modes have a legitimacy in conjunction with a certain concept, the absolute, if and when we ever use that. One last point, and forgive me if this is obvious, but I find sometimes it's not obvious to people. When I say that Hegel's thought is systematically presuppositionless, I just mean it's systematically presuppositionless. Of course, it has a whole host of presuppositions. Language, history, religion, the fact that Hegel's alive, the fact that we have earlobes, there's all those things that are presuppositions of doing philosophy. The issue is, are there any principles at the beginning, definitions or axioms that govern how we are to think? And I think Hegel thinks, no, there aren't, which is why we begin with pure being. So I'm assuming that's clear, but just in case it isn't. I don't think so, no, because the reason, well, in one sense, logic obviously inhabits the element of thought, not of imagination or feeling. But I think the reason, if you like, Hegel privileges thought is that of all the Vermögen of the mind, of all the capacities of the mind, thought has the ability to abstract and to set aside assumptions in the way that feelings and sensations don't. I guess Hegel has some wonderful stuff on feeling, particularly, I think, in the unhappy consciousness. You know, the self that reaches out to the other, but then only ever gets itself, because all it does, it reaches out in feeling. And so, you know, feeling always comes back to yourself, whereas thought has this capacity to abstract. So I think that's what I would say. Feeling doesn't have the capacity to set itself aside, whereas thought does. Right. Well, I suppose. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually very sorry, but I think we had to leave the building, and we can keep talking about substance. It's more over dinner, over something. But thank you. Thank you.